welcome to our dear audience here in Stockholm and also those of you joining us online. My name is Kanika Groeneweg-Tekar and I am an environmental advisor for the Swedish Red Cross, but also very honored to be your moderator today as we are digging into a very important session looking at how private, public, and civil society actors can better collaborate both here in Sweden and internationally to foster more climate-resilient communities, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected states, to create favorable conditions for expanding Swedish business interests while also protecting vulnerable people. It's a lot to unpack. So I'm very pleased to have with us a very knowledgeable panel, starting with Ulrika Moder, Secretary General for the Swedish Red Cross, Florian Kramp, Director for the Climate Change and Risk Program at SIWI, Johanna Reinal, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Swedfund, thank you, and then Eva Mineur, Head of Climate and Sustainability for the Global Challenges Foundation. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Before we dig into the questions for our panel, I thought it might be a good idea to start with a reminder of where we are right now as a global community. Earlier this year, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program shared that 2024 saw the world's highest number of conflicts since data collection began in 1946, continuing a global trend of the world becoming a more violent and fragmented place. At the same time, intensity and frequency of climate-induced disasters are growing. 2025 has been one of the most expensive years for climate-related losses, with more than $145 billion of insurable losses already recorded for the year, and that still doesn't fully account for the immense losses that we saw taking place earlier this month in Southeast Asia. And all of this coming at a time of unprecedented global need and uncertainty, we see the slashing of global aid budgets. Official development assistance among OECD countries continues to fall, now nearing nearly a quarter less than what we saw at their 2023 levels. And that's leading to a weaker and shrinking civil society and aid sector. It's a lot, it's heavy. We need optimism, we need ways forward. One thing that we've learned is that the aid money doesn't disappear, it changes hands. It's moving out of maybe overseas development and to domestic programs, and it's moving out of public coffers and into private ones. In Sweden, as in many other countries, we see a shift away from traditional aid structures towards a stronger focus on private sector engagement in aid, or so-called aid through trade. And with that, I think it's time that we get to our panel to better understand where they might see the opportunities for private sector engagement in aid and where the public sector and civil society sector can add strength to all of that. So Ulrika, I think it'd be great to start with you. Can you tell us, why is the Swedish Red Cross a humanitarian actor both here in Sweden and internationally? How are you relevant to this conversation? And really, how does any of this relate to the question of human rights?
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here with us. Looking forward to the discussion. I think we, as part of the world's largest humanitarian response movement with 17 million volunteers in the front line, we care to make sure that we really meet the needs of those who need it the most. And we are, of course, very concerned in a world with 1.1 billion people in multidimensional poverty, more than 300 million in need of humanitarian support. When ODA is shrinking, we need to make sure that we can leverage finance and actually work with actors who also, alongside with us, believe that we can also reach the 130 countries that are in armed conflict, or the armed conflict, the 130 conflicts ongoing. And we also need to make sure that we can be in countries that we call more fragile. That's where we're needed the most, and we want to see, and we have some ideas also in our innovative finance hub that we've created alongside with other national societies, that this actually can be done, that we can leverage finance also for protracted crisis and conflict settings.
Well, it sounds already like we're off to a hopeful start with some of the ideas that you'll be digging into more in the conversation. Florian, I think this is, I mean, Ulrika already touched a little bit on the number of conflicts happening in the world. I think it's a great segue to you and the learnings that you've recently published in the in your recent report, Climate Resilient Investments in Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations, Opportunities for Business, with the big question mark maybe at the end there. So tell us a little bit more about where you see the opportunities for Swedish businesses to engage in building climate resilience in fragile and conflict-affected economies, but also what's in it for them and really what's at stake if we don't get it right.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think it's a really important question that I personally must admit I have struggled with for some time, because I'm a researcher. I come from the peace and conflict research side. And you're looking at the business side and you're thinking, well, what is in it for you, right? Why would you invest in some of those fragile, most vulnerable countries? Because you have choices, right? As a Swedish company, you have different markets, you have different opportunities to engage in. But there is a lot of nuance in there that we see. I mean, obviously there are different companies. If your company is very Swedish-based and everything is very much only related to your business in Sweden, that is not as relevant for you. If your supply chain, of course, is connected to Asia and imports from Asia, that brings a certain set of fragility and risks and geopolitical tensions with it. But also, depending on if your supply chain is in some of those fragile and vulnerable states, think of critical minerals specifically, we're talking about a different set of facts. I spoke last week with a major tech company, and we discussed a little bit what they are doing and what their struggle is. And obviously, because, well, you're a major player, you need critical minerals, but your problem is you can't source them from certain places where they are, because for good reasons, right? Because A, you shouldn't, because it's morally wrong, and B, it's highly insecure. But the reality is we still need the resources. What these companies tend to do is they run a feel-good program, that is a corporate social responsibility program. They run a human rights project in DRC. That is great. But I think what I want to see is how we bring these things together. How do we bring these different sides that we're having here at the table together? Because that one project is not going to change anything. Like, how do we bring the development aid and these types of interventions together to get to a place where we can de-risk these situations, to open them up for investment and for long-term sustainable divestment? That needs us here at the table, because we bring a lot of we need to put livelihoods and ownership in those situations into the center, because otherwise we know that's another discussion in another hall here, what can go wrong with some of the investments and extractive ways we're acting in these places.
I mean, I think what you say, it resonates so much. We need to move away from this kind of ad hoc project-based approach where it's just on the side, but really bring it core to those business values. And hopefully we see the private sector also picking up what you're saying. Johanna, I assume that a lot of what Florian has just said really resonates with you at Swedfund, where you've already been investing in emerging economies for decades. So tell us, Swedfund's mission is to reduce poverty through sustainable investment. How are you changing the way that you're investing in the most vulnerable contexts? And what makes for, the most sustainable projects, the most valuable projects? And on top of that, I'm going to add on, where are you seeing strong collaborations between these different sectors that we're talking about, between the private, public, and civil society?
Good. So I would be happy to talk more about the opportunities and maybe also what is difficult, but just starting with your question and giving a little bit background to how we approach investments in the vulnerable context, because we as a Swedfund, we invest in the context where you actually see the poverty, fragility, but also the climate vulnerabilities reinforcing each other. 65% of our investments are in sub-Saharan Africa, and for us, the regional offices that we have in Abidjan and Nairobi are really essential. So we work through the teams, the local teams who support us to invest in a responsible way. Then we invest in different sectors that are essential for the development in countries and people in different stages. So we invest in renewable energy, food, digitalization, healthcare, and decent jobs. Then, when we look into the potential investments, it's essential for us to understand the context and the, for example, human rights related risks. So in every investment, we look at the contextual risks, we look at the sector-specific risks. And if we decide to go forward with the investment, we look into the company or project-specific risks and work together with our partner on the market to actually make an action plan on social and environmental side, how to make the project even better. And similarly, climate, for us an investor, it's of course a risk, the climate vulnerabilities that we see in the countries, but also for us, a development finance actor, it's equally important for us to see how can we invest for improvements and a better environment in the local contexts. And in these, both looking at the human rights and looking at the climate vulnerabilities, we actually see the civil society being for us a very important partner and actor, because often the civil society organizations can give us early signs on the risks that are related to the human rights situation, labor, or nature. Or on the other hand, we also work with the public partners, where the public actors are critical for establishing and bringing foundation for the sustainable infrastructure that is also essential for the companies acting in the market. But then, of course, also the other development finance institutions in Europe, we work close with them as well. So looking forward to having a discussion on the collaboration side.
Brilliant. Hopefully we will come right back to that very shortly. First, I want to go to Eva. The Global Challenges Foundation is actively involved in working across sectors to address global catastrophic risks to humanity through improved decision-making, through governance. So please tell us, what kinds of policy and governance changes are you hoping to see that will protect vulnerable communities and businesses from the impacts of climate change among these challenging contexts?
Thank you, and thank you so much for being invited to this discussion and to the panel. And there are so many things that you've already said, and I guess that we'll come back to that later in the discussion. But from where I sit at the Global Challenges Foundation, I think that we often actually frame the wrong conflict. We talk about efficiency versus justice. We invest in mitigation measures to cut emissions where they are largest, or we support the most vulnerable communities who are the most affected by climate change through adaptation measures. But from a risk and governance perspective, justice is actually a condition for efficiency. So without perceived fairness, you don't get political stability, and without political stability, you will never get long-term climate effect policy. So the reforms that we need must actually embrace both of these. You need to work with mitigation and adaptation simultaneously to gain both effectiveness and legitimacy. So that's sort of my starting point. And I also think that we have to move the discussion from just more money into the system to actually talk more about how to create better institutions that can ensure that the money actually delivers real sustainable impact on the ground. So, for example, we need climate laws with clear targets, reporting requirements and sanctions, of course. And similar to the Swedish climate law and the Independent Climate Policy Council we have here, for example, it's very important not only from an accountability perspective, but also to actually set the path ahead. We also, of course, need courts that could actually enforce those laws and have the institutional capacity to also uphold the laws if contested by powerful interests. Of course, banks, financial actors need to be trained to integrate climate risks in decisions, and we also need open data and transparency. That's foundational to track the emissions, but also the results. And this also creates trust in the systems. So, I mean, if we design governance only for carbon and not legitimacy and political stability and so forth, we will not, I think we will fail both on justice and efficiency. This also means that we need to break the silos. Climate is a systemic risk, we all know that, but that means that climate, and I'm talking about both mitigation and adaptation, needs to be interlinked with biodiversity, finance, trade, and of course security. This must be much more integrated and much more coherent, because we all see that the consequences of climate effects spills across sectors immediately, and we see that every day. And this goes for all levels. I mean, on the global level, we need to link the UN climate processes with the international finance institutions, so that climate commitments actually are backed up with economic policy and risk management. And also the security bodies and climate institutions need also to be much more interlinked, so that they can anticipate where climate impacts might increase conflict risks, for example. And of course, on national levels, that goes across ministries. This is not an isolated issue that the climate or environmental minister can handle on its own. It should be something that the whole government is having, to prioritize. So I think that institutions need to be designed and mandated to work in a much more sort of holistic way, to be able to actually identify and also to realize the synergies that are actually there. And this is true both for sectors, but also, on different levels of decision makings. And just my final say, I just have to say this, but, science is, and also evidence, cuts through politics. So, if we have a shared scientific baseline, but if that could be accepted, and here we still have a long way to go, I think that would also be the fastest way actually to build coherence across those different fragmented regimes. I just had to say that, the science pledge.
Thanks so much for underscoring the importance of the science there. I also want to come back to something that you said earlier on, and that was that it's not necessarily a need. We need to move away from the part of the conversation, which is just to bring in more money, but maybe to do different things with that money. And I know that's something that really sits well with you, Ulrika, the need to, you mentioned it already in your opening remarks about the need for innovative finance. So I'd love if you could dig into that a little bit more for us. What does that mean? What does innovative finance mean within this context of the conversation? But also, how do you feel organizations like the Swedish Red Cross can also make themselves more relevant to private sector actors and others to advance that trade agenda, whether through finance or other tools?
So one example that we have within our movement is that the disaster relief mechanism that we have called DREF, that is incredibly important for that kind of first response on behalf of those 17 million volunteers in the front line, has now also adopted a possibility for donors or partners to use it as an insurance mechanism, to actually make sure that you can invest in the insurance instead of just projects. As we were mentioning, projects will not fix this. The question, though, looking at the scenarios, and Eva, you alluded to this, is that whether this will actually work in the long run. But I think what we've seen so far is that it has worked in a number of instances now throughout the past years. So this is a new way of working within our movement that enables also our investors and donors to invest differently, and countries also to think differently about how to also build mutual insurance systems also within their own communities and countries. But I think what I would like to come back to, and it would be interesting to hear also from Swedfund and others, and great to hear that you're investing in sub-Saharan Africa, but our major concern is also that the promise that was made in the Humanitarian Summit back in 2015, that we were to reach the most vulnerable groups, and that we were to localize also humanitarian funding. I know you're engaging in more of long-term development, but still with the scenarios that we have ahead of us, there are so many communities in risk of vulnerability. So the question is really, how can we also develop models like the DREF model, for instance, that really reaches those who need it the most? This is a concern. Sub-Saharan African, yes, but also really, I mean, the crisis and conflict-affected communities and countries. That is a major concern, as we also see traditional ODA that was designed to help these countries and communities divest from these countries and communities.
Thank you. I mean, I think maybe we can take up that question. And I think if we look at global adaptation funds, we're seeing that only 10% are really reaching that local level. And many are getting stuck within middle-income countries or investing in, national level infrastructure programs, which can be important, but we're really missing that link to the last mile. So other panelists, I ask you, I'm posing Ulrika's question to you, how can we make sure that these funds reach, and as they're shrinking and as they're changing, how do we make sure that they reach the most vulnerable? Anybody want to jump in?
Maybe I'll pick up the question there. I think that's a really crucial question, and I think from the Swedfund perspective, how we have approached it in our strategy is that we have a target that 1/3 of our investments should go into the most fragile and lowest income contexts. So we have a specific target set on a strategy investing there. And I think that target is important for us because that also pushes us to look that kind of investments and look that kind of partnerships, for example, from civil society, to understand the context better and to be able to make that in a responsible way. But also to look into the new financing mechanisms, like, let's say, guarantees that help us to reduce the financial risk and actually target those countries. Then I think, just a recent example, I was biking this morning to work and I was listening a podcast on Malawi, which is the 4th lowest income country in Africa and very much prone to climate crisis. And there were some local climate activists talking about what is really needed in Malawi. And they were asking for electricity, they were asking for digital solutions, because when there is a typhoon, there's been lots of typhoons recently, the electricity is put down, the schools are closed, and children stay home and they don't have access to education. And they see this as a long-term challenge for the country itself. So I think it's really crucial for us to think about what are the unlocking mechanisms in these countries, how we can advance and invest for development, because we are, of course, complementary to the development aid actors and humanitarian aid.
Fantastic. Yes, please, Florian.
Yeah, no, I think it's a crucial question, and I think UNDP has done excellent work on the climate finance side, also showing us the numbers, but that is just one picture. That was commitments. We have done a study a few years ago now that looked at what's actually dispersed, and you can imagine how much worse the picture is. We need to change something fundamentally. If anybody wants to have a scary experience, Google climate finance architecture and look at the image search and explain to me the diagram you're going to find. It's so complicated, and I'm by no means somebody who would be like deregulation. Like, regulation is good and guardrails are important and everything, but have we gone too far? And so, and we have guardrails in place. There was a Financial Times study or article 2 weeks ago, I think, on how difficult it is for European companies to access the European climate finance. and thousands of hours that go into that. Now, we have roughly the same system for fragile and conflict-affected states that don't have the resources, that don't have the governance systems, that need to hire external consultants to fill out the spreadsheets to then access the resources. And we're having such a complicated system where we're, for probably from our perspective, good reasons, us separating finance into very different boxes, and climate finance cannot be development aid, and it cannot be humanitarian. And how, in the context that you are operating in, how can you separate that? Like, how is that different, right? It's the climate security risks are real, and they are fundamentally intertwined with everything. So we need to find finance mechanisms that are accessible and actually get into that.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think that's a very clear call for action that we need to be taking forward, a need to start to advocate for, and maybe that's also something we would love to hear from the Global Challenges Foundation, you know, advocate for uncomplicating that climate finance piece. I think it's incredibly important. It's something we've also, I mean, we hear over and over again in the humanitarian sector how challenging it is to have that last mile being really reached by some of this work. Johanna, I want to jump back to you. You know, I think we've touched on it now a little bit, and through the other colleagues' interventions, the importance of that role of the civil society, but we really see it shrinking. I think with the way that the aid agenda is going, we're starting to see that maybe aid doesn't include civil society in the same way that it used to. And so I'd love to ask you, Swedfund, you have a very special kind of constellation as an actor. How is it that you're changing the way of you're working, or looking at how to strengthen the collaboration with civil society actors, both here in Sweden and abroad? And how can you use that to foster the trust that's needed for Swedish companies to be able to access new markets?
So I think that for us, the really strong and independent civil society is essential for the outcomes that we want to reach with our investments. And that is due to several factors. For example, often when we enter into the new markets, we really building a trust and understanding the context is essential. And there, the civil society organizations can give us better understanding on the risks related to land rights, risks related to nature, risks related to the effects on the local communities. And we have recently, for example, to start to look investments into the nature-based solutions, where actually the connection between the nature and the local community and the investment is essential. And then the local communities or the civil society organizations are in a key of designing and helping designing the projects to reach better outcomes. But I think during the pandemic, thinking a little back, for us, we had a engagement with the civil society organizations to actually understand the context better and how we invest. And we have a built-in into the investment process engagement with the civil society organizations. We have a tool that we're piloting currently. We also had discussions with the civil society to shape our strategy, to get a different view and be able to actually have better strategic opportunities and risks pinpoint in that way. And maybe a third area that I would like to mention is then the accountability. So of course, we as an investor, we require all of our portfolio companies to have own grievance mechanisms in place. We provide grievance mechanisms addition to that for different actors, but civil society is an additional voice for us to really hear and understand what is going on the ground, because we want to know. If we don't know, we cannot act, but if we know, it gives an opportunity to act upon things.
Yeah, I mean, and you touched on that a little bit more earlier as well, the role that civil society plays in terms of providing with that background information to make sound investment. And so there's really a lot at stake at you as an investor if we lose that tangibility, that connection to these communities. Eva, I'd like to ask you a similar question. Seeing a shrinking civil society, how do you think this might affect the change that Global Challenges Foundation is trying to drive, particularly through collective decision-making, through governance models? And what role can foundations such as yours play in bringing about greater engagement for different segments of society?
Yes, thank you. And I can just echo Johanna here. I mean, the civil society is, of course, I mean, I see it as a part of the risk management infrastructure, actually, which is, you know, vital because it generates legitimacy, accountability, pick up early warning signals, and of course creates community trust. So, you know, so when the civil space shrinks, the legitimacy that, you know, both governance, businesses, and other actors rely on weekends, which is what we see today everywhere, and it's a really big problem. Another thing that I see that we have to together work with is that, you know, we have a huge gap in that we understand risks in very different ways. So that goes both from a time perspective, you know, short term, long term, but also from an impact perspective, I believe, and that of course leads to fragmented decisions and bad decisions, parallel decisions, etc., etc. Challenges the monitoring, evaluation, and accountability work, and I think we together do have a big role to play in this, and I'll come back to that later. And of course, again, the justice and efficiency, as we talked about, it's intertwined. So if people feel that decisions are imposed, they of course resist them, and that resistance can stall transitions, deter investments, and ultimately undermine both aid and climate objectives, and of course, you know, trade ambitions. So I think that philanthropies like my organization and others can help in 4 ways, probably more, but I'll stay with 4 pathways ahead this discussion. I mean, first, it's by strengthening governance from the ground up, by supporting, you know, participatory platforms, of course, where local communities and civil society sit at the table when transition decisions are made. And I think you really made a good point there about, you know, the complicated system that really needs to be tackled, but I still think that to ensure greater impact and real participation, we need to build institutions and broader governance capacity at all levels, from global down to the local, actually, because this also creates, you know, the true local ownership of this. Second, I think we should, in a much more elaborated way, and also work together on this issue. We need to support what I call risk literacy. What I mean is that we need to get all the actors to operate from, you know, a shared understanding of risk. We can, and I think we can do that by not only working together on this, you know, how to understand the risk, but of course making science more understandable and accessible, and support a more inclusive science policy dialogue. Third, we, and especially my organization that focuses on governance, are financing this, you know, boring governance mechanisms, crucial enabling institutions, I would frame it. You know, data systems, transparency mechanism, independent climate councils, I was on that earlier, that can all in different way, you know, help countries and also local communities to actually govern climate and other global risks themselves. And fourth, we can all, of course, act as catalysts and conveners between research, governance, innovators, investors, and decision makers. I mean, philanthropy can afford to take the risk and I really think that we need to step forward to do that. We can test new governance models, and we can also fund what the public sector can't find, and the private sector won't fund for different reasons. So, I mean, in that sense, defending civic space and investing in inclusive governance in different ways is, I mean, it's absolutely not charity, of course. It is part of building this resilient global system that we in the end need to deliver climate effects on the ground. Yeah.
Thanks, Ylva. I mean, there's so much richness there in terms of what's possible, and it makes me think a little bit of you, Ulrika, and you know, I think you're really here championing the voice of the civil society as part of this giant movement of civil society actors globally. Maybe tell us what resonates a little bit from what Ylva has said in terms of some of these different roles that the civil society can play in terms of fostering stronger engagement, bringing these voices forward, but also raising some of those profiles such as risk literacy. How can we be engaging in any of this?
So I think several of you have referred to civil society as being crucial for risk literacy, in the sense that they have the eyes and the ears there with the communities, and we can do the reading from the local level and up. Then we have a full understanding, you know, what kind of support and how we balance also what you discussed as well, Eva, in your first intervention. I mean, to get the popular support also for the policy reforms that needs to happen, the investments, you know, where they should go and so on. But I think, I mean, and Kanika, you referenced 10% of climate finance going to the local needs. When we look at adaptation, and I was also curious to hear your view on this, private finance only covers 3% of the whole of adaptation finance. And Eva, you also alluded to the importance, we know that also in the climate negotiations, to really meet the demands from the so-called developing economies to invest in adaptation. So how do we then go about, I mean, because at the end of the day, as much as we understand the need to invest in the fragile and conflict-affected settings, in the crisis settings and so on, the intersection between climate and conflict, one of the main problems that investors always speak about is the lack of bankable project. And if that goes for the national level context, how would we then reach the local level context? And are there any examples that you've seen also? And we have some within our movement, and would love also for more to see that there is also need for support to design bankable projects in the adaptation space, so that actually those who are willing to take the risk and invest can see that this is actually the way to go. I think that's a major problem, like the low level of finance to these contexts, but not least also then the lack of structure, if you want, at the local level also with regards to what could be bankable projects or investable models. This is why we have worked with the DREF insurance model, but we need to support our national societies and colleagues also to be part of something that could be more investable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can, I'm sure Swedfund can agree as an investor, but also Florian, from the work that you've been doing, that accessibility of what is bankable is so difficult, especially when we're dealing with a different set of characterizations or what is acceptable risk for different private sector financiers. So I think it's a really important point, and really glad to hear that there will be more investment towards building up these projects to be more bankable and more attractive to private sector financiers. Maybe Florian, on that note, I'm going to come back to you and the fabulous paper that you've put forward. But within that paper, you also talked about the need for localization, about bringing resources, decision-making more strongly to local businesses. And so the question is, I mean, how does that support this idea of bankability? Does that support having more bankable projects on the ground? But also, why would an international business be interested in that? In localizing and strengthening local partners, because aren't they just creating more competition for themselves?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think just to go back to Ulrika's point, I think there's also an element where research is really important to show us what these projects look like. that actually can deliver at that intersection. It's a lot of work that we have been doing on the effectiveness of these types of interventions in the climate space, but also in the food security space. So I think that is really important to show us that this model works, and that's also then reassuring for the international business side that there are opportunities to engage that have actually the impact. Because let's be honest, none of these contexts we're talking about are anyway easy. To run into the platitude, competition is good, right? I mean, I don't think a local business in Somalia or DRC is going to compete with a Swedish global player. But the Swedish global player will rely on these companies as partners, engage with them. And what we see in some of the work that, in some of the examples in the paper that, by the way, is also written by my colleague Kotangu Seyuba, is that actually it builds resilience and redundancies, right? We see the example in DRC that actually some of the solar investments and sort of the microgrids related to that actually provided a lot of resilience in the moment recently when M23 went into the country again. That was one of the only areas that still had electricity. And so it's not taking the conflict away, right? So let's not be naive about that. But it builds the resilience to a higher level, and the entry points are easier again to start off on. And I think that is where we need to identify the opportunities. I'm convinced in this space that the lessons from environmental peace building, sort of the ideas that cooperation around natural resources and environmental initiatives can actually be an entry point for building peace and stability and resilience, I think is actually the model. Probably that's not the wording to use with the business sector, that might be not the right language, but the idea of it and the ideas that are in there and bringing the local communities with us that create this opportunities, because this is not a zero-sum game. I mean, this is like we create these opportunities that build new opportunities, right? And I think that's where we need to have the thinking and find ideas.
It sounds very much to me we're finding that thread of hope back in the conversation again, that create opportunity to find new opportunities. Opportunities beget opportunities. I want to come now to all of you panelists. I mean, it's been a very interesting discussion. What are you walking away with from this conversation today? Have you heard anything new? Are you going to be changing what you're doing? What are the changes that you're hoping to see? Who do you hope to be collaborating with more in the weeks and years to come? And who are you hoping are going to hear what it is that you have to say? Eva, let me start with you.
I'm really... I think there have been so many great inputs from my peers in the panel, and I'm just thinking here, digesting, how can we, as the risk taker that I just framed us as, and how can we contribute in the best way to create that resilience that you are talking about? How do you measure that resilience, and where can we add most value? That's my question that I will have, to go home and figure out and continue the conversation on, of course. But I'll stay there, and I'll come back later with.
Sure, absolutely.
I have an idea for Eva, actually. That
Please.
Her experience. No, but I have, as I worked also in other positions, also with UN, and you referred to UNDP. Always thought, and I believe we've spoken about it before also in your previous position where you were with the Climate Council, that both the national adaptation plans, speaking about driving investments for adaptation and building pipelines for bankable projects, but also the climate commitments, they should be more of investment plans. But as we design that, and I think there's a need to support countries, really have in mind the most vulnerable communities and the most risk-prone countries. Because with the intersection of conflict and climate, I think we have a tough time ahead of us. And if we can showcase, and maybe with some brave actors like Swedfund and others within the family that this actually works. If we could have some best practices, you know, where the national adaptation plans and also the climate plans are working as more of investment maps, and we are able to really leverage some key, I guess, then projects, but just as best practice in these contexts, then I think we could set the scene for something really important, where we use both finance and the scarce ODA resources that we have nowadays.
Brilliant, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very, very tangible call for action. I think also it helps us move away from the idea of tokenism, and it helps move towards that idea of what we started the conversation with, of really wanting to move towards truly integrated, localized thinking into these climate discussions and into building up these communities or communities into more resilient ways. Thank you so much for that intervention. Ulrika, what would you like to be walking away with today, Johanna?
Well, I've been taking lots of notes, so it's hard to choose what I'm going to kind of lift now, but I think what you, Ulrika, mentioned about the adaptation finance, and that's really staying with me, and Florian, also you mentioning the difficult markets, and I think about our investments in South Sudan or Somalia or DRC. I think it's about not only finding the opportunities for investing in adaptation, but also looking into the different companies, partners, entrepreneurs that we work with, how we can support them wider to incorporate the adaptation elements into their businesses. I've wrote with big letters, climate science literacy, because I think that is a key. How can different actors bring the findings from the climate science to the action? And also how we can, you were talking about the data and how we can actually make the climate financing more accessible for the most difficult markets so that we don't put too high requirements, and how we can support the actors.
So I'm hearing from you, climate science literacy, very important there, but also that data, and I think that data piece is really important. It needs to move out of being a very high-level discussion and bring it down to those most local actors. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, and we do see many different actors leading that charge, but maybe we need to be integrating more with them and across from different levels of our organizations. Florian, please.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think this conversation is excellent, and I'm very much looking forward to continue that with all of you. I think one takeaway is maybe that is one actor that is missing on the panel is the actual company, or maybe two actors, maybe the Swedish company and then maybe a local enterprise in some of these contexts we're talking about. But I find that so enriching, and that was the same. Our business, in that sense, is translating science into policy practice. And as I started with, I have a hard time understanding the business side still, right? Like purely from the incentive structures and everything, and the language, and there's so many nuances. So I think that conversation, seeking that conversation, continuing that conversation, I think is so important, and it's something we actually plan to do at the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development in May, which I think can be a great platform also to bring us again together, but then also some of those additional actors.
So I really hear that quite strongly. The need for us to all be starting to speak the same language. Maybe we need to change the way that we're talking, but also hopefully engaging with private sector actors to also for them to start to adopt some of our language as well, and what's important for us as different actors, whether it be philanthropy or civil society or research. Ulrika, you already jumped in before, but is there anything you'd like to add, please?
No, but I think it is an incredibly important discussion, and I mean, it's kind of strange, as I said, as the aid, the overseas development assistance that was meant to cover this ground, you know, where it's needed the most, is decreasing as needs are increasing. Maybe, you know, we're stretching it to speak then, how will we get actually commercial business to invest? But I actually think there are more opportunities than we've seen, and I think the fact that only 3% of adaptation finance is covered by private finance tells a story, and I think we just have to grab the opportunity, because I think it would be, incredibly hopeful, you know, to see if investors would actually find this attractive and long-term, business. That is something. And I think here, of course, we wouldn't be able to do it unless we combine our efforts. But we would definitely be keen to invite you to accompany also what we do on our Innovative Finance Hub, where we're trying to develop new tools and mechanisms to work in the most difficult parts of the world.
Maybe I'm going to take that and come back to you, Johanna. I mean, I think you're the one who's the closest to private sector here as an investor. I mean, what is it that we need to be changing about this conversation? What do we need to bring to investors or to private financiers or to companies to make us all more relevant?
I would like to say that I'm not sure we need to change that much, but what we need to do is that we need to talk more to each other and bring different actors around the table, because I think at the end, every human at the end has the similar kind of a goal where we want to go, and different organizations around the table. But I think we need to understand better what we can do from our mandate and what are the different things that are difficult for us and how we can collaborate together. So I think we need more dialogue.
It's a great way forward. Please.
Yeah, just to add on that, and that is also one takeaway for me, that I think that instead of, rather than adding new initiatives, we should not look at that anymore, entering this implementation phase of the Paris Agreement, etc. I think we need to focus much more on building coherence, building continuity, and that goes with, having, of course, a dialogue, but also look at the institutions and governance in place and see where can we find how can we leverage the synergies that that is in there. But so I think that is one thing that I'm really take away from this conversation. I think that's super important.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm sure the last thing anyone wants is more initiatives doing the same thing, so we need to make sure to synergize. Please.
Some old initiatives, I think, should be brought back. I think the cost of inaction, for some reason in the IPCC reports, that is not really spelled out. So I think this is also really the business case. The cost for inaction. And this is, of course, why insurance is an interesting way of building an instrument, but there are many more, of course. I think, and that's where we also can look at the bonds also for green investments in a different way. I think if we get a better framing on the cost of inaction politically as well.
Absolutely, cost of inaction. And it's so relevant to all actors to better understand what are those costs and who's truly facing them at the end of the day. We have a few minutes left, so we'd love to open up to our audience. If you have any questions for esteemed panels, please raise your hand and Maya here will bring you the microphone.
With no possibility for the online audience then?
No, unfortunately not. I don't.
You can contact us later.
Yes.
Thank you, Kanika. Thank you, panelists, for this interesting discussion. I have a question to Johanna, actually, on you were talking. I thought it was a fantastic thing that Swedfund is actually earmarking 1/3 of your whole budget to these this most difficult context as well. But do you have, if you're allowed to share, you have an example of where you have been investing in a fragile context and you've been involving some kind of civil society actor to, for instance, de-risk or for that kind of accountability to communities? That would be very interesting to hear. And just a quick comment from my side on speaking with Ulrika mentioned on inaction. If you saw the UNEP's Mastodon report on global environment outlook, it was specifically mentioning this call for action, that it's cost much less than the inaction. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's say recently, for example, we've been investing. We opened the office in Abidjan a few years ago, and have been increasing our presence in West Africa. There, of course, the agricultural value chains are an example of an investment opportunity, but also opportunity to reach lots of smallholder farmers who are kind of prone on climate impacts of climate change. And if they are in even also in a fragile or conflict area, it makes the situation even worse because it's harder to implement these adaptation elements. So before we entered into this market in West Africa, we discussed, for example, several actors to understand what are the risks in the value chain and what could be done. What are the existing programs that we could seek to collaborate with? So that's an example.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other questions from our audience here? I can certainly ask another question, maybe to you again, Johanna. You mentioned about nature-based solutions entering your workspace in terms of investments. I think it's something we're hearing more and more about, but there is also this hesitancy around them as they are considered to be less reliable or less investable as some of our grayer solutions. So tell us a little bit about how Swedfund's been able to navigate that and using nature as a way of being able to build that resilience for these companies.
How long time do I have? No, I think this would be a discussion on its own. It's definitely not easy. Then on the other hand, how would I say, we wouldn't be needed as an actor if it would be easy. So we're also there to take risk and look into the difficult but impactful opportunities. I think if I look at from my perspective, some countries, for example, in Africa, they have a great resource that is in nature. There are forests, there are mangroves, there are areas that are really valuable for the biodiversity and important for the local communities. So it's really trying to find ways how can those natural areas become a value for the local communities, but also help with the global climate action to generate first, I think, first the carbon credits, and then in the future, hopefully also biodiversity credits. But of course, there's a lot of risks and there's a lot of challenges that relate to the human rights, that relate to the, I don't know, labor rights, that relates to the climate and biodiversity related issues. So it requires a lot of work and collaboration with the trusted partners who are locally anchored.
I think that, I mean, there's so much that you said there that's so valuable. I mean, certainly we hope to see some of these newer financing tools coming forward, or not new, but carbon financing tools, but also this shift towards biodiversity credit is something very exciting on the horizon. But that also the part about the trusted actor. And I think that this is really a strength that we need to be starting to push and leverage a little bit more, that there is so much there when it comes to being a trusted actor, not only when it comes to being civil society actors who are present on the ground, but I think also as a brand as Sweden, that there's a lot there in terms of being a trusted actor. Sorry.
Yes, and if I can just mention one thing, when we talk about Africa, we talk about the fragile context, and of course there's a lot of fragility, but I'm also very kind of conscious about the narrative that we have, because there's a fantastic entrepreneurs, there's a lot of resilience and creativity in people and the communities, so it's also important to keep in mind. I think often the perceived risk is higher than the actual risk.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wonderful. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much, esteemed panel members, for joining us today. It's been an absolutely brilliantly enlightening conversation. Thank you all to all of you here in Stockholm and joining us online. Please do connect with us on LinkedIn or other social media. We'd love to hear more of what you have to say. I think this is just the beginning of a very interesting time ahead for us and many interesting discussions to come. Thank you so much. Goodbye.